Within the larger probability field of all of the different ways that masculine and feminine energy within each one of us can express itself, the sexual template, which is a pre-verbal pattern of masculine and feminine energy creating flow together, is the shape within that entire probability field that is embodied by our environment. Now, our environment includes the family system. It can include our own lifetime system. It includes our parental upbringing, and most particularly our parents' marriage and the relationship between the culture and the parents. Because masculine energy is the energy of the point, of direction, of leading, of initiating, of, in the harsher expressions, imposing or dominating. The culture is typically in a masculine position in relationship to the family. You could think of the government as being the dominant force. If there's a law that says if you walk the streets bare-breasted, you will be arrested, for example. That's a masculine imposition in relationship to the citizenry, which is in that sense more of a feminine role in that moment. So the child in a pre-verbal and verbal level absorbs the pattern of flow between the masculine and feminine in the family, in the culture, in the family system, and in the relationship between the more masculine presence in the family, traditionally the father, and the more feminine presence in the family, traditionally the mother. And the first thing to understand about the sexual template is that it includes both roles. That for example, in a sexual dynamic where in fantasy or in reality the man or the masculine figure is raping a woman or the feminine figure, the dynamic in consciousness includes both sides of the polarity. So it is in this sense, a masculine part of ourselves dominating a feminine part of ourselves. And in the full consciousness of the dynamic, we are sublimating and repressing or pushing away, most often in a chauvinistic culture such as our own, the feminine, in order to emphasize and identify with the masculine in ourselves in relationship of dominance. But in doing so, we are perpetuating the helplessness that dominance is often a response to. And so there's always a symmetry within the psyche between the masculine and feminine roles. And if we identify too strongly with the role of in this case the feminine, the abused feminine, to a point where it floods awareness and threatens the sense of egoic safety, then we will partition and minimize that aspect of the feminine to move to the identification of a masculine role that is in a dominant position with the feminine that we are dissociating from, both internally and externally. Now, to find your sexual template, look for the point of flow. Now, the point of flow is the point where the most dimensions are engaged most intensely, and you get lost in the movie, so to speak. When you kind of lose all awareness of the self, there is a certain surrender to flow at full intensity with all senses, and the consciousness is really locked in. Now, the point of flow can otherwise be determined by the point of highest sexual intensity. That's the point of moving towards the template, to where there's very little gap between what the template is and what we're thinking, feeling, doing, and imagining. Now, the template on an emotional level is it's always symmetrical within the masculine and feminine. So, for example, if the feminine component is one of heightened arousal due to fear and excitement, let's say that that's one of your peak flow points, well, then on the masculine side, the heightened awareness is coming from the predatory, willing to intimidate and scare point within the dynamic. Now, what's important to understand is that regardless of where the ego identifies as I'm this role, the self is relating and experiencing both roles. Regardless of where the ego identifies, the self is part of both roles. And so the template is that a region of intense flow, which one can map out imaginally by, for example, exploring the arenas of peak sexual arousal. Because sexuality is simply a physical embodiment of a dynamic that is mental, emotional, and physical. And so we're dealing with a dynamic of flow. Now, one of the problems comes when there's a split between the message that this is what one does if one is valuable. This is what one does if one is respectable. This is what one does if one is respected and valued. And yet, that's not what one does to create peak flow. In other words, all of my imagination, etc., is all about raping or being raped. It's all about dominating or being dominated. And of course, these go hand in hand, meaning there is no flow if there is not both sides of the continuum. There's no flow unless one person is in the intensity of flow about being raped and the other person is in the intensity of flow of raping. And so the thing to be aware of that is beneath all of the culturally conscious frameworks of connection and disconnection, of what is and isn't appropriate, is that connection trumps design. Meaning that if one moves into a framework, culturally, personally, and family, of dissociation and isolation, in order to avoid the fact that what is flowing is within a framework that has cultural messages of this isn't valuable, this isn't right, that's bad, I'm a bad person for enjoying this, whatever those messages are. Connection trumps design, meaning if you do not find another way to connect that is superior in consciousness to this dynamic, then you will generally reconnect in the format that is undesirable. So, we've, for example, decided that rape is a terrible idea, blah, 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 blah. And we've also decided, we're constantly moving around with what rape is and what rape is not. But it does not change the fact that we regularly give birth to both men and women who both want to be raped and want to rape, because that energy of intense violation and suspense, etc., captures imagination through the intensity of sensory experience and through the reconnection with the preverbal masculine-feminine template, in which we are on a planet where the masculine element within the culture rapes the planet as opposed to blessing and honoring and asking and partnering. We don't carefully dance and touch the landscape in a way that our Native American ancestors might. We buy a plot of land. We clear cut all the trees on our schedule when we want something with zero gratitude. And we walk away as if that land and those trees had no soul, no value. And we say that's a satisfying, capitalist, materialistic experience. Well, that template is identical to I take what I want, when I want, from the girl I want to fuck, with no gratitude, and walk away as if she meant nothing. It's the same template of masculine and feminine energy, just migrating from a landowner and their land to a man and a woman, or a masculine woman with a feminine woman, or a masculine man with a feminine man. And so when the template of relationship between the masculine and feminine is set preverbally, that becomes in order to stay sane, meaning to stay integrated and to relate to the reality that is there around us, that is the template that we're dealing with. And so in that dynamic, to connect with ourselves in many ways is to reenact the template that has become the default, the belief at a certain level that this is how the masculine needs to relate to the feminine, and that that's a good thing. Having decided that, if we then culturally say, no, it's fine to rape land, it's fine to deposit garbage in the water, but it's not fine to deposit garbage in this woman or in this feminine man, then there's a disconnect between the rational script of what should be done and the core template that we've become in order to attune to the environment in which we are a part, an environment in which there is regular and intense violation of the feminine by the masculine, and that this is culturally blessed, culturally accepted and tolerated and encouraged. And as a result, in order to meet needs for survival, security, love, and belonging, this template is formed to say, if you want to connect with this particular world at this particular moment of time, then it's within this template. Now, templates have varying levels of intelligence. And the definition of intelligence is the amount of well-being generated by a given recipe of thinking, feeling, behaving that creates a certain amount of well-being with a certain amount of raw energy. And meaning energy takes the form of time. That's one form of energy. Another form of energy in our culture is money. And another form of energy is natural resources. We could also say another form of energy is our own bodies and stuff, but we could put that in a natural resource category. And so, one way of engaging creates a certain amount of well-being, whereas another way of engaging creates another amount of well-being. And each amount of well-being takes a certain amount of energy. The most intelligent pattern of engaging takes the least amount of energy to create the most amount of sustainable well-being. And in the case of a clear cut, it's probably at the 20% point in well-being. At the point of a rape, it's probably it's not very high on the well-being relational continuum relative to so many other ways of engaging. And yet it may be the most intense, meaning it may line up with the inner physiological and psychological patterns to such an extent that it is the phenomena to which we are most present, in which we experience an intense flow on a certain level. So, to work with a sexual template, which is much deeper than just physical sex, we're looking at the template for engaging between masculine energy and feminine energy, number one. Number two, in order to understand where our point in that relationship is, we need to look at the wound, the primary emotional, physical, psychological wound, one. And we need to look at where we identify within the wound. The wound is one of violation, dissociation, insanity, confusion, pain, and unnecessary suffering. So this is kind of the territory of the wound. And within the territory of the wound, there is a masculine expression and there's a feminine expression. In the territory of the wound, there's a voice that says, I'm going to do this, or this has to be done, or I've got to do this, or whatever. So that's the masculine expression. And there's a voice that says, I can't help this, I've got to let it be done, or else I have to allow this, etc. And within the broadest sense of sexuality, this is not just genital contact. Genital contact is simply one version of this. So the parent, I've got to hit you, I've got to beat you, it's got to be done, it's for your own good. The child, I've got to be beaten, I've got to be hit, I can't fight the parent, it's for my own good. I've got to shoot and kill this animal, I've got to steel myself, I've got to kill this animal, it's what needs to happen for life. If one was to consciously identify, with the animal, well, I've got to be shot. It's what, the humans need to survive. I've got to make myself get out of bed. I've got to allow myself to get out of bed even though I don't want to. It's the right thing. These are all masculine-feminine conversations within our semi or fully conscious mind. And they are following a template that has a certain degree of violation, meaning there's a certain degree of emphasis, and we are identifying within that conversation primarily with one or the other within a mental, emotional, physical landscape. So I may be terrified of being abandoned in a culture around me that will abandon me if I don't have money. And so I will do all kinds of things to get money. And I'm terrified of this or that if it's not happening, I may be terrified. On the other hand, there's a part of me that is being bullied by my terror into doing all these things out of terror that it doesn't really want to do, but it doesn't want to be bullied by the part of me that is terrified of what will happen if I don't have money. And so there's an intense amount of energy tied up in these different patterns of thinking and feeling that are all around avoiding overwhelming trauma, overwhelming loneliness, overwhelming fear, and all about feeling more safe, more secure, more like one belongs within the culture or cult in which one is a part. So the thing to be aware is, let's say you're a slave trader. So that's now you're in the role of the dominator. You're in a masculine role. So you're going to tie people up and make people do what you want them to do for their own, well, for your own good or whatever it is that you're constructed to do that. You are also the slave. And it's important to understand that this is always a symmetrical relationship. Now, what the ego can do, because the ego is like a little flashlight, the ego is like a little flashlight within a much bigger system. And so the ego has the choice to identify with both the feminine and masculine. And to identify, all it does is it shines its awareness on one side of the component. For example, within the individuality of the human lifetime, we ignore the fact that we're part of an ecology that is the entire species. And so we just shine our light onto an individual and say, that's me, and all those other things are not me, which is, would be kind of equivalent of a finger, shining a flashlight on a finger and saying, I'm this finger and I'm not the rest of the body. This is scientifically illiterate, because if you cut off all the rest of the body and try and keep the finger alive, it doesn't work. If you kill off the rest of the species and try and keep an individual alive, it doesn't work. Meaning, an individual goes insane and loses language if nobody's there to teach them language, if nobody's there to talk to. And so the individual, and the individual cannot accomplish all that much. Just take a desert island somewhere, take a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old infant and stick them in the island and leave, and see what is there. If you return 10 years later, is anyone there, first of all? Is anyone there? Can it speak any language? Has it accomplished anything? Is it sane? It's a very shaky proposition to say, this is me, I have nothing to do with other people. When other people provided the clothes, other people provided the technology, other people provided the language, other people provided the guidance, other people provided a passport, whatever it is. It's an unscientific proposition to say, this is me, and it has nothing to do with other people. But the ego can focus on the me, even as I'm breathing the air of the trees. So my body doesn't exist without trees, and I'm drinking the water of streams, and my body doesn't exist without streams. And as I honor the grief, as I honor the grief between the gap between the culturally sanctioned mind and the deeper scientific reality, my dog rushes down because at some level my dog does not exist without me, and at some level I do not exist without my dog, given that the dog brings 20% of the well-being in my life, which contributes to this generosity, and given the fact that without me, this dog would probably be dead. So there's a And there is, of course, a relationship within the template to how I respond to the feminine presence of grief. When grief brings life to my body, when grief releases some of the pain carried by my body to maintain the template of separation, then there is a healing of sorts and a wholeness that comes if I invite in the grief, if I allow the sneezes, which are one of the cues that my body tells me that I'm grieving. Then there can be a gentler return to symmetry and wholeness than there can be with with doing nothing. So one of the responses to any template, which is usually held in place at some level by trauma, an underlying awareness that to violate this template is to violate the connection with the culture, and is therefore to experience the trauma of dissociation and separation. Is to bring consciousness to both sides in the template. And that involves, for example, if we, one of the reasons that sexuality is so interesting is that arousal and pleasure will communicate where these templates are in both people. Fantasy will communicate this. And so if we go into into language around this, there is some part of me that wants you to do this to my body because there is an intensity of arousal and a predisposition. And there's some part of me that understands that this takes me in the exact opposite direction to the direction that I say that I want. There's a lot, you've now got 3 poles in the space, the stated desired future, the stated way of getting there, and the desire and the template. You've now got 3 in the space. And if both of you, if both partners go into those 3 poles, bring in consciousness, the first thing to become aware of, and it is very important to do, is to become aware of what the template is. And the second, to whatever extent possible, to understand how it was formed. And the third is to understand how intelligent it is. How much sustainable well-being is generated over time with this template. For example, the monocropping of American farmland, the rape and application of various herbicides and pesticides is not only killing human beings and polluting the rivers and killing the rivers and eroding the soil. It is becoming more and more expensive and difficult over time to maintain that system. And the people in that environment and consuming that food are showing a variety of correlating side effects. And so it is very intelligent from the design of efficiently using machines, which include the commodities market, combine harvesters, bank loans, etc. But these are synthetic designs, meaning human ego consciousness created combine harvesters, created loan policies at banks, created the commodities markets, and created the real estate markets. What's being decimated are the complex ecologies of biodiverse species, and what's being violated are the different health and ecological consequences of these policies. So that's not being taken into account. And as we learn with Bernie Madoff or any other kind of system, we get into trouble when you have a double entry bookkeeping system where half of the numbers get withdrawn. In other words, we make poor decisions when the benefits of a particular decision are noted down and the costs of a particular decision are not noted down. And then we proceed based on those numbers. So this is the problem with corruption. Is you go bankrupt running a business that way, but you also go bankrupt ecologically and bankrupt in one's relationships when running those relationships in that way. So this is an important area of of growing an awareness. And once you bring consciousness to the intelligence level of a template or a design, you can then participate in the question, how are all the different ways that these same time, money, and energy resources could be restructured to be much more healing and much more beneficial? And where does that lead us?